Okay, it looks like we're live. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Mind and Life Europe inaugural panel. It's really, really wonderful to see everyone, and I can just see all of your different faces if you've got your camera open, and to see old friends and new friends from all around the world. And so it's really exciting that you've chosen to join us this evening or afternoon or morning, whatever your time zone. And for those of us who are maybe new to this tradition at Mind and Life Europe, just to give you a really, really brief overview of what we envision the inaugural panel to be at Mind and Life Europe. Since 2022 at MLE, we, the team, with the help of the community, have chosen a different banner theme or umbrella theme, as we've come to call it, that has shaped some of the questions that we've asked ourselves as an organization, as well as the content of many of our programs. So our flagship programs like the Summer Research Institute or our online programs like the Mind Matters series. So it's really a way of infusing our programming with a certain focus around certain questions. And so this year, we felt a certain urgency to find new ways to link our theoretical work in the enactive approach and well beyond the enactive approach in the approach to contemplative science, for example, as well, and to contemplative methods, to link that theoretical work with the concrete ethical dimensions of our lives, examining more closely and critically how our ways of knowing are in dynamic relationship with our ways of being and interacting across a multiplicity of life worlds. And so in that spirit, we wanted to invite the community, which is you, and also our researchers in the association, and of course our panelists this evening, to hone in on a value, as we call it, at Mind and Life Europe. And it's in fact a new value that we've just added, which we're calling relating to the worlds at hand. And on the back of the value, we have these value cards at Mind and Life Europe, and Amy Cohen Varela, who will be co-hosting the evening as Mind and Life Europe's chairperson. She can say a little bit more about the history if she wants later, but we have a little adage or explanation on the back of each card. And on the back of this value, it reads, "Poised between readiness and openness, engage wholeheartedly when called." So this evening, alongside our 8 distinguished colleagues, we hope to reflect together on some of the unresolved tensions we experience as we are called to wholeheartedly engage, poised on that razor's edge between readiness and openness. Rather than presenting a series of prepared talks, the panel is intended to be a conversational exploration, a lightly guided peregrination among colleagues and friends, which Amy Cohen Varela and I will help to accompany during the first hour. And then in the second hour, we'll open it up to a discussion with the live Zoom audience. So please make sure to save your questions for the second part of the evening, and you can also write them in the chat as they come to you. And we'll be sure to moderate the discussion in the second part of the evening. So before I pass the baton to Amy to get us started with the first invitations for reflection for our 8 panelists, I'd just like to go through all of the really rich bios of our panelists to present them to you this evening, if you don't already know their absolutely phenomenal work. And we will try to spotlight them. Maybe we can spotlight them one by one so we can fill the screen with our panelists for the first part of the evening. So our first panelist, and this is in alphabetical order, David Abram, who many know as a cultural ecologist and geophilosopher, is the author of The Spell of the Sensuous, Perception and Language in a More Than Human World, and Becoming Animal, An Earthly Cosmology. Described as revolutionary by the Los Angeles Times and daring and truly original by the journal Science, David's work engages the ecological depths of experience, exploring the ways in which sensory perception, language, and imagination inform the relation between the human animal and the animate earth. David's philosophical craft is informed by his fieldwork with indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia and the Americas, as well as by the philosophical tradition of phenomenology. Dr. Abram was the first contemporary philosopher to advocate for a reappraisal of animism as a complexly nuanced and uniquely viable worldview, one which roots human cognition in the dynamic sentience of the body while affirming the ongoing entanglement of our bodily experience with the uncanny intelligence of other animals, each of whom encounters the same world that we perceive, yet from an outrageously different perspective. In his first book, David coined the phrase, which I think many of you have heard, especially in his wonderful Mind Matters Gaia series talk just over a year ago, coined the phrase, the more than human world, in order to speak of nature as a realm that thoroughly includes humankind, yet also necessarily exceeds humankind. And the phrase has now been taken up worldwide within the broad movement for ecological sanity. And so we thank him for that. And Dr. Abram has received many numerous prestigious awards, including Rockefeller and Watson Fellowships and the International Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction. And he is also the co-founder and director of the Alliance for Wild Ethics. So welcome to you, David Abram. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Sāgaradevī Barratt, our next panelist, is a senior lecturer in the School of Health and Social Care at the University of Essex, program lead for the Masters of Science in Medical and Clinical Education, contributor to the Professional Doctorate in Clinical Psychology program. Since 2014, she's been interested in contemplative pedagogy and has been applying contemplative ways of teaching and learning in her practice, as well as developing opportunities for other educators to develop their skills and knowledge in the field. Sāgaradevi's recent theoretical work explores how the enactive approach and recent develops in the cognitive science of wisdom can support the development of theory in contemplative education, informing future research and deepening understanding of its potential contribution to human flourishing. Her past empirical research using qualitative methods has touched on a range of topics related to mental health, trauma, and social marginalization. In the future, she hopes to develop her research in education, as well as exploring how the lens of inaction might contribute to research in mental health and social care. Sāgaradevi is a founding member of the Contemplative Pedagogy Network and an ordained member of the Triratna Buddhist order. So welcome, Sāgaradevi. Nice to have you back in this capacity. Our next panelist, Stephen Batchelor, is a contemporary Buddhist teacher and writer, a prolific writer at that, I should mention, best known for his secular or agnostic approach to Buddhism. Stephen considers Buddhism to be a constantly evolving culture of awakening rather than a religious system based on immutable dogmas and beliefs. In particular, he regards the doctrines of karma and rebirth to be features of ancient Indian civilization and not intrinsic to what the Buddha taught. Buddhism has survived for the past 2,500 years because of its capacity to reinvent itself in accord with the needs of the different societies with which it has creatively interacted throughout its history. As Buddhism encounters modernity, it enters a vital new phase in its development. Through his writings, translations, and teaching, Stephen engages in a critical exploration of Buddhism's role in the modern world, which has earned him both condemnation as a heretic and praise as a reformer. His next book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us, Ethical Living in Uncertain Times, will be published by Yale University Press in August of this year, 2025. So welcome back, Stephen. It's really nice to have you back, Mind and Life Europe. Our next panelist, Jennifer Branlat, is Associate Professor in Gender Equality and Diversity at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Jennifer is originally from the United States. She holds a PhD in French Cultural Studies and worked at Antioch College before moving to Norway. She's particularly interested in pedagogy, inclusion, and teaching outside the classroom. Her recent project, a collaboration with 3 other colleagues, uses microphenomenology to understand the ways in which people experience affirmations and other micro acts of care and kindness in academic contexts. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us and for coming back after last year's Esri. Really nice to have you. Our next panelist, Hanne De Jaegher, is a philosopher and cognitive scientist. She most notably developed the theory of participatory sense-making together with Ezequiel Di Paolo, one of our other panelists this evening. Participatory sense-making theory is being used across academic and practical disciplines from neuroscience to the arts and beyond. De Jaegher also researches and writes about autism and dementia in close connection with people with lived experience and innovates interactive methodologies. She thinks a lot about loving and knowing as both existential, tensionful relations and how they can illuminate each other in philosophy, cognitive science, and our intersubjective lives. With Ezequiel Di Paolo and Elena Cufari, she co-authored Linguistic Bodies, The Continuity Between Life and Language, out from MIT Press in 2017. Currently, she's working as an interdependent scientific advisor and teacher, among other roles, for Mind and Life Europe. And so thank you, Hanne. We're really glad to have you, especially since your work with Ezequiel Di Paolo was really the centerpiece of our reflections about the theme this year. So we're glad to have you both here. And so Ezequiel Di Paolo is our next panelist, is a full-time research professor working at Ikerbasque, the Basque Science Foundation in Spain, and a visiting professor in the Department of Informatics at the University of Sussex. His interdisciplinary work on embodied and enactive approaches to life, mind, and society integrates insights from cognitive science, neuroscience, phenomenology, philosophy of mind, and computational modeling. His recent research focuses on enactive theory, embodied intersubjectivity, language, ethics, and participatory sense-making. He is co-author of over 180 publications, including the books Sensory Motor Life, An Enactive Proposal from 2017, and Linguistic Bodies, along with Hanne De Jaegher and Elena Cufari, The Continuity Between Life and Language from MIT Press. He's co-editor of the forthcoming annotated edition of Francisco Varela's Principles of Biological Autonomy, which will be out from MIT Press. So thank you, Ezequiel. Really wonderful to have you back as well. Our next panelist, Erin Manning, studies at the interstices of philosophy, aesthetics, and politics, concerned always about alter-pedagogical and alter-economic practices. Pedagogical experiments are central to her work, some of which occur at Concordia University in Montreal, where she is a research chair in speculative pragmatism, art, and pedagogy in the Faculty of Fine Arts. Recent monographs include The Minor Gesture from Duke University Press in 2016, which I would recommend to everyone in this room tonight, For Pragmatics of the Useless from 2020, and Out of the Clear, Minor Compositions 2022. Her artwork is textile-based and relationally oriented, often participatory. She's interested in the detail of material complexity, in what reveals itself to perception sideways, in the quality of a textural engagement with life. Her work often plays synesthetically with touch, an acknowledgement and experimentation with a pro-tactile movement for deafblind culture and language. Tactile propositions include large-scale hangings produced with a diversity of tools, including tufting, hooking, knotting, and weaving. 3E is the main direction her current research takes, an exploration of the transversality of the three ecologies, namely the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. An iteration of 3E is a land-based project north of Montreal, where living and learning is experimented. Legacies of her former Sense Lab infuse the project, particularly the question of how collectivity is crafted in a more than human encounter with worlds in the making. So thank you, Erin. It's really wonderful to have you back with us this evening. And last, but certainly not least, our eighth panelist this evening is Antonino Raffone, who completed a master in psychology and a doctorate in cognitive psychology and science at Sapienza University of Rome. He's currently associate professor in the Department of Psychology of Sapienza University of Rome and visiting professor and advisory faculty at Nalanda University in India. He's also director of the Inter-University Center ICONA at Sapienza University of Rome, president of Consciousness, Mindfulness, Compassion International Association, and chief editor of the specialty section on consciousness research of Frontiers in Psychology. His internationally recognized research is interdisciplinary, with a particular focus on cognitive neuroscience of consciousness and meditation. And he is also a dedicated Soto Zen practitioner. So thank you, Antonino. It's really great to have you with us this evening as well. And so with that, with all of those many, many words, I'd like to invite our chairperson of the Board of Mind and Life Europe and the beating heart, as I could say, of MLE, Amy Cohen Varela, to open us up for the evening with a few questions.
The beating heart, Johanna. Thank you. Thanks very much. So we have some questions, but first I'd like to say that the Mind and Life community, the team, all of us and the audience are very, very happy to celebrate the start of this new year, because this is a panel that we hold at the beginning of each year, and it's really wonderful to have these presences on stage for this celebration, as well as those of you in the audience. Thank you, all 8 of you, for coming to dance with us, for coming to create for us this experience of presence that is really, really different and distinct from a kind of conventional talk and a Q&A. Improvising brings a sense of concrete immediacy that is like a dance that has to be executed in a unique way, that is executed in a unique way and with a unique temporality and a unique configuration that happens only one time, and then it will be over, and then it will transfigure all the things into echoes that will be vibrating in the minds of all of us throughout the whole year. So the work, the thinking, the play, the dance that we'll be doing tonight will inform our thinking at Mind and Life Europe throughout the year. And so for that, I thank you. And thank the audience for your future questions and thoughts. So generally what we like to do with these panels is to start out by doing a kind of round the room thing, even though afterwards we definitely expect you to be freewheeling and do whatever you want. So with the topic tonight, and Johanna already mentioned that it has to do with what we call our Mind and Life Europe values. Values could be a good word. We could come up with a better word. And she mentioned the cards, so I just thought that I would show them to you. So this is one of them. And then this is another one of them. And I won't show you all 8. We have 8 of them. Here's one that we all really love. And then maybe I'll show you the last one. Well, there's one other one that we love, actually probably the most. That one. And they have on the back little quotes and little suggestions, and we comment them and we use them sometimes in our meetings when we need to see clarity or something like that. So with our topic tonight at MLE, as Johanna said and suggested, we're going to be making it concrete. Making it concrete. That's the title of a paper by Francisco Varela, written in 1992. And MLE will be spending the year making it concrete. We'll continue to investigate the theoretical aspects of enactive cognition and participatory sense-making, but we'll also be turning our attention much more closely to concrete practices, to different kinds of know-how, of situated action, of how we spontaneously cope with what comes up in the moment, sort of like what we're doing here, above and beyond, but also alongside what I'm calling, and actually Francisco and a few other thinkers before Francisco called know what, which includes our capacities for reflection, abstraction, judgment, much less transparent, you could say much more opaque kinds of thinking, much more consciously reflexive kinds of thinking. And, or you could say knowledge about stuff, as opposed to knowledge of how we go about getting to the stuff or dealing with the stuff. And actually, I have a little quote in my notes here that says, that comes from that text by Francisco that says, know what reflection, this is not him, this is me, no, but this know what are actually aggregates. And I thought that that might resonate in the Buddhist ears. The know what is actually aggregates or clusters of readiness for action. So I'd like to start us out, as I said earlier, by just going around and saying a few words that can be mostly about your experience. In fact, a lot of you have, it's such a versatile group and everybody has thinking practice, and not to make too much of a distinction between the two, but thinking practice, but also practices with objects in the world and the environment and animals and other people sort of outside of academia or inside of academia. So I'd like to get some preliminary words from each of you on how this distinction, know how and know what, resonates for you, if it does. How in your lives and practices you might experience this distinction between knowing how, knowing the how of the knowing and the what of the knowing. And if you care to let us know if you feel that this distinction has any pertinence for your process and progress in the world. So maybe you could just raise your hand when you feel like you want to riff on that. I'm reminded, thinking of this, that Bill Thompson, Evan Thompson's father, used to talk about mind jazz. So maybe someone can start with like the first note of the improvisation. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having invited me to this meeting. It's a great pleasure to see those of you who I recognize from previous occasions and to encounter so many new faces. Where I would start in my own response to this question is the fact that I'm now retired. And I've thought a lot about retirement and what that means. And it doesn't mean stopping work. For me, retirement has to do with being able to retire from what I have to do, duties, obligations, and so on, in order to spend my remaining years focused on what I most deeply want to do. And in that sense, my focus, I hope, for what remains will be to really give myself as wholeheartedly and totally to my work as effectively a writer. But more and more, my work, although it is a hidden part of my work, has to do with making art. And I've been making collages for the last 35 years now in tandem with my writing. And I find now the two are somehow converging. And what this means for me is really about composition, composing words, putting words together, sentences together, chapters together on the one hand, and on the other, composing collages from found pieces of discarded paper, cloth, and whatever is lying around that I can stick on a piece of card. And these are aesthetic projects. They're very much to do with a certain quality of know-how. And composition for me is refining that intuitive capacity to know what goes together with what else, whether it's the words in a sentence, whether it's a load of pieces of paper and plastic that I found. How do I compose them? How do I put them together? How do I therefore make them something more than they are in themselves? A book or collage or whatever it might be. And these are very much aesthetic projects. And I find now that my writing now is very much working on the similar principles as my collage. I let the process unfold. I open myself completely to what the world is throwing at me at any given moment. And I completely trust, and this I think is crucial, this way of being, this engagement with my own inner life as it impacts the outer world in all of its detail and all of its suffering and all of its beauty.
Hi, David. Go ahead, Sāgaradevī, you got a raised hand there.
Great. So yeah, I just really resonated what Stephen said, but it's a slightly different kind of example. But when I was on my ordination retreat, I thought I knew what my life then kind of was going to look like. So I had a clear but abstracted idea of what that was going to be. And then I came back from that retreat, and it's been anything but like that. So there's been a real process of knowing how to live my life now that my thoughts about what it should or shouldn't look like have had to be put aside, because actually the experience of that living of my post-ordination life has been very different. And in particular, I have come back and fallen in love with my job again, which I hadn't really anticipated. I kind of thought I'd return to work and then decide it wasn't for me, and the absolute opposite has happened. But I think part of that is really engaging with it as this kind of creative enterprise. And I loved when Stephen said about his artwork being about refining this intuitive capacity to identify what goes with what else, because that is what my teaching life is like now, developing that intuition about what goes with what else in terms of what goes with what student, what goes with what subject, with what topic, with what method. So that's really what that kind of resonated with for me, that difference between the thoughts that we can have about our lives and the world, but then that reality of living that can be very different if we allow it to be. Thanks.
Ezequiel.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone. I think it's a really interesting question to look at the relation between knowing what and knowing how. I mean, one can think about it from a theoretical perspective, but since you ask for some personal insights, I have a personal insight that will eventually lead to the theoretical perspective, which is that there isn't much of a difference when you look it carefully at what you're doing, what you're knowing what and knowing how. Or you could say it's knowing how all the way down, even though there are obvious and useful distinctions you can make. So I started my studies as an engineer. Not only that, but when I was a student, I engaged in this crazy project of building a log cabin in Patagonia. And this was continuous with my studies at the time of physics, engineering, and I realized that I was approaching all these problems in the same way, whether this beam was sufficiently long and strong for this job, or whether this algorithm was the one I needed. It was always that feeling that I think I never really, stop feeling, even when I'm thinking about ideas, doing something very theoretical. Think of a watertight argument, how those metaphors have a meaning because of how they invoke those practices, those understandings that we gain from our connection to materials, to projects that sometimes are urgent because the winter is coming and we need to heat up the house and things like that. So in a way, in my experience, there isn't much of a difference. And of course, we can qualify that later because one can always talk about different kinds of know-how. But like as Stephen was saying, when you're composing, when you're writing, it's also a sense of how things work together. And you could do that with words, and you could do that with bricks, or you can do it with almost anything, how things work together and how you're participating in it. That's knowing how. It's always knowing how. So that's my first reflection.
Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you for these experiences, and these are resonating a lot with how I am experiencing teaching. And I want to go back to a couple of things that Sāgaradevī said, because I can remember talking to Sāgaradevī about teaching and being in academia this past summer. And when I heard that you had fallen in love with your job again, that was really that really like warmed my heart. But this idea of learning how to do things, I think I would like to take this back to the beginning of the paper where you are opening up the concept. And I have realized in the past year or maybe two, maybe this is after the pandemic, but there is this sort of, I'm more aware of this sort of like pervasive environment that is present in the university today and that I see in the classrooms. And it relates a lot to these sets of challenges that you've set out in the beginning of the paper. And so, while I can't say that these challenges that are very abstract in a way they're not really present in the unfolding all the time of teaching or the situation of being in the classroom, but I sense them somehow. It's like these, and I can refer to them specifically, like these world challenges that we're facing, or the changes that we've seen in academia over the past decades, where it's more about, the sort of neoliberal reforms have changed the relationship between people. This is a pervasive atmosphere that I think is sort of pressing down on the way that we can experience the world and the kinds of things that we can do in teaching, right? This is like, maybe we could say this is affecting the sort of agency or sense of agency we have in the classroom. So for me, these past 2 years have been about like learning again sort of how to teach, and this involves like bringing in hope into the classroom, because I can sense in almost every moment with the environmental humanities students and the sort of gender studies students that this hope, this sense of not of how can I say it, not of naive optimism or something, or certainty that something's going to turn out right, but the idea that we're pursuing something that matters, right, and something that makes sense in higher education. So so concretely what this looks like in terms of lived experience is like this relational pedagogy of holding off and not knowing like how I'm going to do things, but knowing that I'm going to build up from meeting the students that I have that given semester, and creating what unfolds in this 12 weeks together. And I think that's a lot of work, but I think it's quite worth it. I think that's all for now.
Antonino.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting sharings. And personally, these are very, of course, deep questions, both theoretically and experientially in life, in our shared existence, in this big world challenges that we have. Personally, I have first addressed the issue of this participatory being and the enactive approach through Soto Zen practice, actually, through a spiritual path, and going in my theoretical work about consciousness, other things. I have to say, I arrived later to the enactive approach. What is interesting is that now there have been developments in my research work that pretty much go in the enactive direction, and for example, collaboration with Sean Gallagher, and addressing the self, addressing the compassion in this really deep enactive way. But going back to the experience, to being in the world, in the assistance with others, I have to say that meditation has given a lot to me, the practice of Zazen in particular, and starting from this knowing, just knowing, this dimension of beyond subject and object, but then also bringing it in the world of the cushion, in everyday action, where it is in Soto Zen is Genjo, is really bringing it in every action, which is necessarily a shared action, is taking responsibility for the world. And I am very much touched by wholeheartedness, this wholehearted presence. And there is a wonderful teaching by Dogen Zenji about this, to be wholehearted in the world. And in San Francisco Zen Center, this is very emphasized, this element of wholeheartedness. And so, another aspect that comes to me is the interdependence of knowing what and knowing how. And in some of my research, I have to say, with my brilliant younger collaborators, is about, for example, ecology and ecological mindfulness. We have, it's very important that the gap between the actual knowing or the awareness, for example, of the climate challenges, and the action, taking action, enacting a response. This is very important knowledge or awareness action gap, which I think is very important to bridge them between the knowing. And I think the knowing how is the crucial element there, to be really addressed. And related to that, there is also the element of, from one side, to be in a way, to be touched in a sense, but at the same time also not to be reactive, this element of reactivity. And Reb Anderson Tenshi Roshi, this great teacher of San Francisco Zen Center, emphasizes don't touch, don't turn away, meaning not to be, of course, to be fully participatory in one side, but wholeheartedly, but at the same time avoiding that our habit loops, our usual way of reacting, automatic ways of reacting, kick in at the same time. And this, I think, is an important aspect of both awareness and taking responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonino. Dave.
Yes. Hi, all of you. There's such a sweetness in being able together with big-hearted folks in the intimacy of one's own home. I'm here in the States. I'm in the upper Rio Grande Valley, so northern New Mexico, where we, like people throughout this country now, are in a kind of stunned immobility, shock, bracing for more shocks, very puzzled, befuddled as to how to move as this new administration settles into its position behind all the levers and cranks of power. And it's a remarkable moment, certainly a very painful moment for many of us. There is a clear sense of what we want to move toward, what the what is, the imperative of deeper compassion, solidarity, a kind of conviviality within our culture, and a lightness as well. But the how to move toward these things now, well, we're all flummoxed and kind of stuck and destabilized and wondering how. And I think it's kind of a beautiful moment of just taking some deep breaths in and out, and slowly noticing from these kind of micro movements and gestures within our musculature, certain actions shape themselves that are, at least first now, involve, well, what's present at hand, what is most nearby, what is the needs of the local community just here, the community of persons with the various immigrants and quite a few undocumented immigrants in our terrain, and other folks who are isolating in their homes because their position in the LGBTQ community makes them also trembling with terror at this moment that militias have been loosed on the streets again from there in Washington. So a sense of how do we make community, local community, not the community of folks we feel through the internet and the vast webs of solidarity that are somewhat abstract, but in the world I meet with my whole animal body, which is the local world, this terrain. What is needed here? And so I just think that first gesture of going local and the specificity of the high desert here, which calls for modes of action and protection and care very different from the bioregion on the far side of the Jemez Mountains, or on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains just above my home. What does this valley ask of us? What forms of solidarity and care? And of course, it also involves attending to what the plants here need as the snows are dwindling, and so a more intense fire season is in the offing. How do we attend to what's near to hand?
Hanne.
Hi, everyone. It's my turn. Amy, as you were speaking, and you said, know what? Know what? I'll do it with a card. Know what? And what appeared for me was this. Let me see. To me, it became really like, know what? Exactly. What do we know? And how do we know? And what's happening in the world right now? I mean, I really don't know anymore. In a way, like the question mark just became like, yeah, very big. But I think it's to do with what you also said, David, that, being close to the US here in Canada. And of course, everybody in the world is close to the US because there's no choice about that. And what I think is happening, or what is happening, is putting much more clearly onto the stage of the world and in many of our lives, is a great disturbance of participatory sense making on many levels. And that's what we're dealing with. Or that's part of a way how you can describe what we're dealing with. Like, how do we make sense together? Or how do we make sense, all of us in the world, when things are told to us and actions are taken that are extremely disturbing to how we live together, and also that are blatant untruths about how and who we are and how and who we can be in the world together. And this discourse, I mean the discourse coming out of the leader of the US right now, for instance, but it's happening also in other places. The discourse is surrounding us, and we move in it, whether we want to or not. And it takes us up and makes us, willing or not, contribute to that discourse. And it's really awful. It hurts to participate in it, but it also hurts people who are not as privileged as I am, much, much more yet. And how to deal with all of that, I really wonder. What do we know anymore? I mean, knowing clashes. And I also think, David, you said conviviality. And I think the retreat to the local is important, and because that's where we build community and where action can be taken and we can go to action. But it's not, so conviviality might sound a bit like it's, and also the wholeheartedness that you mentioned, Antonino. It might risk like going towards a kind of goodness when we are actually in a convivium, living together with really different needs and at a very basic level. And so there is also strife and struggle, and that is also there. And that's part of this, of what we always have to do in the world as well. So I think that needs to be also acknowledged and part of how we think and deal with it. And then in terms of what I think participatory sense making does and can do, as I say often, as I always say, it's like understanding conceptually better what it means to participate in interactive dynamics, but also experientially what it is to really come up against the shock of lies being told, for instance, about how we can live together. And so I do think there's work for us here. I mean, for me, but sometimes I also wonder, is it practical enough? And yet at the same time, I think for doing the practical work properly, the ethical work properly, the theory is also absolutely basic and important, and also real work happens there too. But anyway, that's a conundrum. Practice theory and being in the real world and doing it's really a conundrum more and more. Yeah.
Oh, I guess it's me. I'm the last one. It's been really interesting to hear all of you. And David, one of the worst things about being Canadian is that we can't vote for those elections that change our lives, which I know Hanne feels as well. Yeah, I wanted to go back to a knot for me, which is the opposition between the concrete and the abstract. All of my work happens in that question of that opposition. I consider the approach that my philosophical work takes, I call speculative pragmatism. And by that I mean it's the question of how things work and what else they do. So the how things work is it's a really lived question. It's an inquiry. It's at the level of play. It's at the level of experimentation. But I don't think that happens less in concept building than it does in chopping wood, both of which I do a lot. And so one of the things I want to give you an example, but one of the things I think a lot about is concrete for whom or abstract for whom. And over the past 2 decades, I've talked often about how a body is a really, really abstract proposition. I mean, the idea that a body could be separate from the world is just the biggest abstraction. No child would buy that if you tried to explain to them that they were separate from the world, right? So I often think that the things we think are concrete are abstract and vice versa. And then there's also the problem of neurotypicality. And the ways in which we're taught to be in the posture of a certain kind of abstraction or a certain kind of concreteness, like whose modes of intelligence fit where in that dichotomy. And the example I wanted to give, maybe links a little bit to, well, definitely to a few people talking about pedagogy today. I'm being punished right now in the university. It's not an unusual thing. I seem to be punished a lot. I was banned from undergraduate teaching for about a decade, and then I was banned from graduate teaching. But they have to make me teach because, you know, I'm a professor. Anyway, right now I'm being punished for the work that we do with the three ecologies, which they consider too practical. Right? No matter what I do, I'm doing kind of the wrong thing. And so the punishment is to teach more, which is something I've been thinking a lot about, like this very strange thing that those of us who teach understand teaching as a punishment, when it's really truly the only thing that's good about our jobs, I think. But anyway, so here I find myself in the classroom more so than I have been, and I'm teaching some undergrads and young undergrads, so like maybe 20. And I realized I didn't know maybe the question, the know what. I really didn't know who they were, you know, what they wanted. And in Montreal, we've had really pretty nonstop young people on the street in pro-Palestinian demonstrations and in camps. And in my university at Concordia, this is the most awful pushing down of that movement, even though it's the university that is the most activist oriented. So it's been a confusing moment, and I hear my colleagues often complaining about these young people. They'll say things like, the students don't show up for class anymore, and since COVID, the students blah, blah, blah. There's like all these scripts. So I thought, well, maybe I would just ask them what course they wanted to take. So I called the course Concepts for the End of the World. And I suggested to them that we would make a book together, or many books, or whatever a book is, we'd have to figure out. And that we would then read this book to the people that we love. And so the first class, I gave them all an A, and I said, let's build this class. And it's just been extraordinary to see the students learn what a concept is and choose their concepts. But last week there was a student, second class, who came to me and in the break, and he said, I don't mean to be rude, but what's this for? And I said, oh, well, what do you think it's for? And he said, well, I think it's for like talking a lot about words. And I said to him, could I ask other students? Would it be okay? So when the class started again, I said to them, you know, what's this for? I said, you know, you already got your A. You don't have to be nice to me. And it was heartbreakingly beautiful. You know, all these students talking about how the world doesn't grow in a way that they feel they can see themselves in, and that maybe this concept work would allow them to find a way for the world to be theirs. At the end of the class, I went back to the student and said, so, you know, did that help? And he said, no. And I thought, you know, maybe part of our work is also to hear that no. Like the student's like, no, I don't think so. But then he came back about 15 minutes later and he said, oh, I think I figured it out, Erin. I think that what I'm doing here is learning. And I just thought that was really beautiful, because it wasn't like good, but it was like sort of recognition that, yeah, okay, she's going to make me do something. I already got my A, so I might as well hang out for it. Though I have to say he didn't show up for class this week. So maybe in the intervening time, he's decided he'll just take his A and go elsewhere with it.
What do you
Great
think,
stuff.
Dave? Are you pondering a response, Dave?
Hmm?
Are you pondering a response? Or
Or
Who are you calling on here?
you? It looked like you were pondering a response.
Oh, no. I'm pondering in response, but not a response. I just thought that was a wonderful story Erin just told. And I'm sitting with the sense that that we're all, at least on this continent, but more generally, and in the wide scheme of things, we're all standing in a moment of utter perplexity and shock, at least everyone I know here. And so it's just wonderful to sit with the question of how does one walk? How does one move? And it really does seem to rely on first opening the senses and listening through the eyes and the skin and the soles of one's feet to what is moving in the world around, not just in the human terrain, but in the more than human complex of lives and sensations and experiences. Before we move.
Can we talk a little bit about this opening? I wanted to go back to what you said, Stephen, about doing your collage work and your writing work and seeing them as being two different ways of seeing how things go together. And you said, I opened myself up to this knowledge, this intuition, actually, you said, of knowing what goes with what. So could we talk a little bit about this opening or this listening and how it works?
Well, I was struck by what Antonino, the sort of Zen guy, and also what Hannah also said on her chart, that when it comes to the what question, I feel it's very important to always hold that as a question. My own training in Zen Buddhism in Korea focused entirely on learning to live with the question, what is this? And that's a practice that I've been doing ever since. I've been doing that for about 40 years now. And I feel it's a way of dealing with the question of what. The what always, I think, has to leave an opening for I don't know. We can form provisional and perhaps useful answers, or especially to sort of practical problems we have to deal with in our daily lives. But the kind of questions I think we're dealing with here, whether they be of a political nature or a philosophical nature or an artistic nature, I think really need to, in a sense, constantly honor the fact of not knowing. And I liked Hannah's idea, or was it Erin's idea, of pragmatic skepticism. I also think of myself as a skeptic and as a pragmatist, actually. I'm not interested in the truth. I'm not sure. I think that's a highly dubious notion, ultimately. Helpful, of course, perhaps necessary. But I think the being able to remain open, as you say, Amy, and that openness to me is founded on a very somatic feeling of not knowing, of somehow being able to celebrate one's ignorance. And I feel that so many of the entanglements that we get caught up in is because we are locked into certain certainties. And I think with the political stuff that's going on now in the United States, particularly, how much does this rhetoric that we hear all the time just push us into a tighter grip on our own certainties? I think it does that. I think there's a polarizing going on in which two groups of people, both of whom are convinced that they're right and their view of the world is correct, are in a kind of a standoff. And I think that is a completely uncreative and inoperable space to be in. We need the courage to not know and to acknowledge that ignorance, but not in a purely conceptual way, but in a way that we're actually feeling that within our bones. And to me, that's where the source of imagination, of inspiration, begins to grow. And whether we access that through meditation or through being in nature or through our work in schools or whatever it might be, that I feel is what the foundation of such openness should be.
Erin.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm a little bit with you, David. It's so hard to think about anything, you know, it's a hard moment right now when you realize the lived threat to the people we love. It's I don't know how much the rest of you have been reading about what's been happening, but I work in communities that are very, very fragile or vulnerable in this moment. And so I was thinking about this openness and the challenge of having an open body that when your body is anxious, because anxious bodies are by nature protective.
Yes.
And I think one of our biggest challenges is that I guess this goes back to the conversation about the local, and I'm really just thinking on my toes and, you know, but how do we learn to be not individuals in this approach? To really be working across not only a human environment. I want to give an example. It's again a teaching example. It's the third week of class, so that's what's on my head. In another class I'm teaching, I have a deaf-blind person, John Lee Clark, an amazing thinker, and a deaf person, Adrian Clark, and I have a typer, a non-speaking autistic, Adam Wolfand, on top of another 40 people. And what I constantly find in being in an environment like that, with different interpreters, with different ways of using language or not using language, for those of you who may not be aware, in the new language of deaf-blind folks is protactile, so it's a touch-based language, is that you really are working in an environment that is full of difference. One person's openness may really not be another person's openness, or one person's belief in communication, like the belief that something has come across, may not actually be that way. And so what I find a lot in that context is that I spend a lot of time having to rethink what I thought was thought collectively with people with whom I share. Like, these aren't people where there's a tension of belief in a kind of fundamental sense. But just using the text as an example, you know, I would be in the class teaching a text, reading closely is my practice. So we read sentence by sentence, we read out loud. But you can't read sentence by sentence in the same way with Braille. And Adam, who's autistic, doesn't work sentence by sentence. So you have already different ways of approaching a text in a context where people's bodies are not totally tense with the anxiety of being deported and so on. So I wonder often about what techniques we have collectively to move through those differences. In generative ways, in convivial ways, thinking here of Edouard Glissant's idea or concept of difference without separability. So rather than moving into the in common, how do we think together in difference without separability?
And just to clarify, separability, Glissant referring there to separability in the sense of being cordoned off from one another.
Yeah, or even like this kind of ecological relatedness that is the world. Like, how do we do the question of difference without it culling or partitioning?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it often does seem to me that there is a great blessing that comes from separation in its most basic sense, that I engage my neighbor across a depth of spaciousness, or that me and the ponderosa pine just out my window are separate by 15, 20 feet, so that I can see it a bit from a distance and fall in love with it, and it can fall in love with me. Whereas if we were not separate, we wouldn't have any way of really dancing with one another. So there's something I love about also distance and gaps that make conviviality possible.
Ezequiel.
I think okay. I've heard different themes braiding together, and I don't find myself in agreement with some of them. I think what I find myself resonating with was something that Stephen said about ignorance and certainties. And I sometimes hear these words such as conviviality, and I can really follow the meaning of that. And at the same time, I feel that at least there is a certain habit of treating the other in its all otherness as outside my community. You seem to be able to form a community with plants, but talking to Trump supporters may be more difficult, but perhaps more urgent, and to understand where they're coming from and what. If this understanding of conviviality had been in place, I think history would have been different. But the polarization is driven by everyone who is in it, and I believe that understanding that our knowledge is limited and questioning our certainties is easier said than done, it seems to me. And I'm not wanting to minimize the actual problems that have been mentioned here, not at all. But I want to say that a real change is, we cannot change it. We cannot just think it in the abstract. To pick on Erin's distinction, it has to be concrete. Of course, concrete, it can be, but it has to also be challenging of our certainties in order to move forward. And hopefully meeting on the other side someone who perhaps is also receptive to being able to communicate. It's just, I'm picking some of the ideas from Hanne's work on engaged epistemology here, but it's the difficulty of talking across the difference that is the real challenge. Not that there aren't any other challenges, not to say, I don't want to minimize anything, any problem, but I think there is a certain urgency in that difficult, challenging problem.
Thanks, Ezequiel. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you, Ezequiel. I felt like I was almost bursting while you were talking. I just want to give a very concrete intervention about an experience I had this fall. So one of the Erin, you were describing some of the ways that you meet the class that you have in front of you right at that particular moment. And so the class that I had this fall decided that the most pressing issue for them, and the issue that was really weighing on their sense of being able to imagine a future, was the idea of polarization. So we worked together to the second learning activity that they had in the class, because we have to have these very like institutionally driven learning activities, right? But we can define them how we want. And so each student in the class had to go find someone that they sort of thought that they would have nothing in common with. And most of the time this was political, right? This was not a tree, but this was like so I'm in Norway, but there's a lot of talk right now, for example, about energy justice in indigenous communities, and of course the sort of pro-Palestinian or the Palestinian activism that's very present at the university right now. And so the students had to find someone with whom they had nothing in common, that they thought this was the case, right? And so I don't know, this led to many different sessions together. And the thing that they reflected on coming out of this activity was how many experiences were experiences of like feeling surprised at how certain they had been going into the interaction, and then realizing that that was completely turned upside down. And I can't tell you all the specificities that they sort of met in these situations, but it was really, I think this was one of the most moving teaching experiences that I've had, because I mean, my sort of understandings of how they might do this were changed, and they really just I don't know, it was a really powerful moment. But I think I agree with you that this is critical, right, to meet people across our certainties, or what we think these communities that we don't think have a lot in common with us. There's also this really beautiful Guardian column about dining across the divide, right? And this is very accessible for students, but they feature these situations where people have to go and eat with someone across the political divide. So these are beautiful experiences, the way they're told as stories. Yeah.
Can I jump in there? So this reminds me what Jennifer's just shared of something that Hannah and I discussed very briefly on a Zoom call last week around the importance of that embodied presence with another human being for allowing us to have the imagination to hold the possibility of their world as well as our own. And the example that comes to mind for me personally was, for example, I found with one of my stepsons when he was a teenager, I could be really angry with him in the abstract, really frustrated. And then as soon as I was confronted by this vulnerable young person, all of that kind of just disappeared, you know. And on the call with Hannah, we were saying about how when your contact with other people is not embodied, the effect, the capacity for that interaction to kind of disrupt our view and to allow space within us to hold the possibility of this other world, I think is not the same as this kind of embodied face-to-face kind of contact. So yeah, just to contribute that.
Antonino.
And just following up, and Stephen mentioned one other word that has been highlighted is entanglement, no, and the relevance of it. And Stephen has mentioned the aspect, let's call that can become and entrain in a sense to be this sense of involvement that is more in a sense of, if you like, an habitual reaction or a judgment that, in a sense, make complicated things. I mean, we are in a very complex, world, in very complex, and then I thought maybe, okay, entanglement from one side mean that when, let's say, unhealthy way of relating reverberate and can reverberate globally. We know, for example, through the social. But also the entanglement as a constructive aspect, and that relates, for example, to wisdom, a shared wisdom, and how much is important then to have this stance of wisdom, a stance of course, ethics and compassion in our world, and because in a way or the other we are all interconnected, no? The topic of, from one side, the element of locality, to be in wholehearted presence in the world, in the situated aspects around us, in the immediate, but this unavoidably resonates with the web, of our world or our worlds. And then is also an appreciation of the work that is being done here, and this sharing, which goes pretty much, in my view, in the direction of wisdom, a reconstruction of meaning, and this beautiful sense of co-creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonino. Ezequiel.
I just one thing wanted to add, because I very much agreed with what Sāgaradevī was saying. And I wanted to mention some studies in schools in Argentina. I think the author is Mariana Lozada, who has been doing what she calls enactive interventions in group of children, essentially embodied interactions, participation, a series of, doing things together. And they measure many things, and normally these interventions are beneficial in many ways. But one interesting aspect is that they measure the affiliative social networks, essentially who wants to play with whom, and who do you not want to play with. No, I don't want to have anything to do with these people. And that these negative networks all get transformed after the intervention. They are more like, oh, they're okay. I can work, I can play with them. I mean, many also reports of saying, yeah, I didn't like them, but now I like them. They're okay. We can play together. So it's that embodied, interactive, participatory element. It seems that it just brings us directly into that, common encounter, that ground that we build together in participation. And I would say, yeah, sometimes it can work, sometimes it cannot work. But if you have that, what a powerful beginning to establish a way of talking across the difference, And that's yeah, it was very much resonating with what you were saying.
Erin.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that and come back to what you were saying, David, about the separation, because I think it is always both and, how do we think about this? But I wanted to talk about a very concrete situation here in Montreal. The neighborhood we live in is primarily Jewish Hasidic. And over the almost 20 years that we've lived here, all really of the white Quebecois have left. So now a neighborhood that used to be quite upwardly mobile white has become mostly Jewish, Hasidic, Black, and Asian. It's a better neighborhood now. But this racism against the Hasidic population is something that we've lived with. And I wanted to bring that up because there are impasses in a sense, in many senses. I have no interest in shaving my head and having 12 to 15 children. We have different ideas about where our lives matter and how they matter. In 2014, we decided Sense Lab hosted an event that was called 3 Mile Meals. So we had 3 public kitchens, one in this area of Montreal, where I worked for about a year with women here to build the public kitchen. Then 5 minutes away in a Muslim area, I also worked with the women to build a kitchen, and in a gentrifying kitchen in another neighborhood. And the aim was not to have things in common, but to see that we could come together without having things in common. That's what I was trying to get at. Not to resolve our differences, but to become curious about them enough that we could have a sense of humor. We're looking at really kind of minor things, but they can make a big difference. And so for 3 days, we had these 3 public kitchens where we had challah in Outremont, we had dosas and we had crêpes. So we had these 3. And even though we worked for a year, I hadn't thought through the kosher and halal problems. So it turned out that, the Hasidics couldn't eat the dosas and vice versa. But what was really interesting to me, 2 things were really interesting to me. One of them was that the next year, the folks in the Muslim community hosted a dinner that was halal and kosher. So there was a kind of continuation of this work, which in my experience does happen if you create conditions for an encounter where you're not trying to force people to be in agreement with all the details of their lives, that something else can happen. But also a really rich conversation that I had in that period. Our son was struggling with drug addiction, and it was a very hard period for us. And one of the older men, the Hasidic men, I would talk to him. We found out that my philosophical background and his religious background could meet in certain literatures. And he told me one day that it must be so hard for the young people in my community to have to reinvent a reason for being in the world every day. And I thought it was just such a generous way to approach the question. And I also noted that my non-Hasidic neighbors weren't busy talking to me about it. And so I think sometimes in this kind of celebration of an irresolvability of difference, that you can still be in contact, you can also learn where your own presuppositions could be a little bit off.
Mm.
Very nice. Unresolvability. Celebration of unresolvability.
Yeah, if I might just jump in on a moment on that, on what you're sharing, Erin, but also linking to what Antonino was saying about entanglement. It can feel so much, of course, that things we do in growing community, a motley community here in the high desert, of course, is richly entangled with things going on the other side of this broad terrain, which are then entangled with dimensions, realms, regions on the horizon of those terrains. And so it actually ripples out quite profoundly. And yet, if I, and this may be painfully obvious to all of us, but whenever I'm trying to tune to and respond to large scale global unfoldings, I can only respond to them abstractly. It's only here where my body is emplaced that I get to engage all of these myriad facets of my body, my subtle muscles as well as my thick ones, and my subtle senses and peripheral senses, all these parts of me coming into play. Some of them I'm conscious of, many of them I'm not, but in the synesthetic entangling of these different parts of myself when I am in full-bodied interaction with the other bodies around me, persons and places, then I'm kind of connected, as you were saying, everywhere. But when I'm trying to relate everywhere, I'm not really engaging and having any effect anywhere, and no place is actually affecting me. And somehow I was feeling that also in what you were sharing, Erin, that in some way, we're all really called to improvise at this moment in the world's unfolding. And I find it very hard to improvise abstractly or to improvise in the abstract. Improvisation happens only when my whole creaturely flesh is engaged with other creaturely, full-bodied organic presences. And inorganic, stones and rocks can also play their part. And finally, that relating to and touching a stone or dancing with a storm cloud is not at all, for me, something that's easier than actually working with across these ideological divisions with sisters and brothers in my immediate community or my neighbors here. It just feels like until I'm opening to the wider than human context of agencies and powers that are not just human, my human engagements stay much more brittle. But as soon as I notice that I'm also being actively supported by the ground underfoot and nourished by the wind gusting past both of our homes and bodies, somehow it fluidifies all of my human interactions, become much more, fluid and flex.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I think I agree with what Ezequiel initially said. It's know-how all the way down. I like that expression. Maybe what this is leading us to is a kind of a necessity or a pointing towards the need to develop our improvising skills, which brings us also to this suspension of knowing what, or this openness and suspension of the question that Stephen was talking about. But speaking of questions, we have an audience out there who has some for you. So we have half an hour, if you can all stay for another half an hour, and perhaps open yourselves up to what they have to ask you or what they have to say. Johanna, I think you have a question already, or some questions already.
Yeah, I'll start with an anonymous question that came in as you, the panelists were speaking, but also people who have questions, feel free if you'd like to raise your hand, and then we'll see your hand, your virtual hand, and we can unmute you so you can actually just pose your question spontaneously to the panel. So I just wanted to start with an anonymous question, which says, do we also know too much? Is increased communication simply mirroring the apparent and perpetual fragmentation of the world, and therefore apparently destroying relationship at the same time as creating wonder, including with the self? So I can read that again since it's not in the chat if you'd like. So do we also know too much? Is increased communication simply mirroring the apparent and perpetual fragmentation of the world, and therefore apparently destroying relationship at the same time as creating wonder, including with self?
Yes.
And
Hanne.
Yeah, I don't know if I heard the question right, but it made me think of the idea of over and under determination in the loving and knowing epistemology, because, yeah, I think knowing too much would be a way of knowing too much about an other and thereby determining them and them not being able to speak anymore in such a way that I can hear it. But you can also overdetermine yourself as being a certain way and then not being able also to maybe hear what another is saying who is really different from you. So definitely, I think we can know too much and that can impede communication. But it seemed to me like the question was also, we know too much and we keep then talking. And so there's a lot of discourse going on, and we are putting things out there and knowing too much. And therefore that also impedes communication, because we are not standing still and listening and giving ourselves and the other the capacity to change or to transform through our not knowing, our stillness.
I think also we can make decisions about how we relate to all the information that's available to us, and we don't necessarily have to be bombarded to the extent that we perhaps sometimes feel that we are. You know, we can exhibit agency around how many things we subscribe to, how much time we spend on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's something particularly in the academic community that, particularly since I came back to work, is I think I really used to want to be certain about things. Yeah, I really wanted to feel like I wanted to know. And actually, I think the greatest value of contemplative practice for me is being able to let that go and to see the possibility of humility and vulnerability that opens up when we let go of that idea of needing to know, even within an academic space. that there is a creativity there and there's room for compassion and all of the things we've kind of been hinting towards this evening. So I think for me, explicitly exploring what it means for us to know and perhaps allowing for the possibility of not knowing and is of real value in the work that we've been discussing tonight.
I was struck by the word wonder that concluded the question. It seemed to be hanging in a way, but I wonder if in fact that did not actually contain the key to, it would certainly be a key in my response. So I think not knowing and ignorance go hand in hand with wonder. That when you begin to somehow let go of a lot of your opinions, your certainties and so on, and you do this in meditation all the time, is that it doesn't just leave you just feeling stupid, I don't know, but actually it's a kind of not knowing that opens up the world as an extraordinarily wondrous, sublime, an experience of the ordinary that is totally and utterly extraordinary. And that if all of this Zen practice I've done over the years has had any benefit, it's because of that. And that, I think, is what establishes a foundation for creativity and imagination, to think outside the box, to be able to have ideas that are not just reflexes of your own convictions and views. And that, I think, is the kind of freedom also that is spoken of so much in contemplative practice.
And Ezequiel just put in the chat, if you don't mind me reading it out, Keats' negative capability.
Yeah, there you go.
In that. Beautiful. Yeah, connection. So I see we have another question already. If we can maybe, if no one else wants to riff on the previous one still. So Ida, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Johanna. And thank you all very much for this input. And I felt a lot of reverberations in my body whilst I was listening. I could feel my heartbeat going up and down, and really bodily experiences whilst listening to you all. And that's so wondrous. Yeah, that also makes me wonder what's happening, you know, with me, with my body, with world. And whilst I was listening, there were so many things which came up, and I probably could start talking now and don't stop for 15 minutes. But I will try to bring it down. Stephen, I see as one of my teachers, and from him I learned this, what is this meditation, which, as I hardly sit anymore on my cushion, is part of my life. What is this? This sense of wonder in everything that happens. Another of the people, I mean, I see everybody as my teacher, also the enemies, so to say, but another really beloved teacher is John Peacock. And John Peacock, I hear his voice, you know, saying this: when this happens, that happens. When this ceases to be, that ceases to be. And that's another thing I try to really take into my life and always look, oh, this is happening. What's happening next? And again, this sense of wonder, what's happening? And what I notice, I become more playful with these things in my surroundings. And John Peacock also talks not only about ignorance, but he likes to pronounce it differently. Sometimes he says ignorance. And that's also an interesting word thing, you know. So what do I ignore? And then I think of somebody else who always says you can only see. No, you can only know what you see. And I would even say you can only experience what you experience in a way. You know, you can only know what you experience. And we all experience very different things, not only in the world, because we are all embedded in a different part, in a different location at any time in our present on this planet. And at the same time, we are also connected to our technology and embedded in this realm. And the technology, of course, is also, doing something with us, and we can only experience or understand what we experience. So what the algorithms feed us. Yeah, and I think this might turn into a question to Ezequiel Di Paolo, because he has this background of being an engineer and computer scientist and having all these connections. I also love that we used, or I heard the word entanglement very often here. So I find this really interesting how these things come all together. And maybe one last thing. I noticed that most of, at least the panelists, because I see the panel right now, is maybe Generation X or even baby boomer years. And there are hardly any youngsters here, obviously. You know, probably, I don't know about the others here in this room, but I personally trust so much in the youth. And I can see so many of the young people around me who are actually what I would call non-dual, who don't see the separation at all between, this is black, this is white. They see diversity everywhere and they live it. And they're also a little bit rebellious. And they're also, they have grown up with playing computer games all the time, from early ages on. So I find this really fascinating how when we zoom out and look at things from outside, from Mars maybe, and look on planet Earth, what's happening here? What's happening here? It's wondrous. Personally, and this is my last sentence, this gives me hope, a lot of hope. Thank you. And sorry for my long rant.
Thank you, Ida. I think you planted many more seeds in the discussion. Each one, I think we could probably follow in some sense. Yeah, go ahead, Ezequiel.
I just want to say thank you, Ida. And talking about entanglement and the view from Mars and hope, something that has given me a lot of hope in the last 10 days or so has been one of the most interesting internet events in history, which was the massive migrations of TikTok users to RedNode, a Chinese network, where they found that over there's just people like us, and they get to cook fantastic dishes, and they're funny, and they are respectful, and they want to stay there. And I thought some of those testimonials are just very moving. I cried listening to some people saying, I cannot believe, I wanted to build, when I was a child, I wanted to dig in the sand my way to China. And then they told me, no, you don't want to go there. And then suddenly I realized yes, it was a mistake to think like this. And the really most moving part of all was that, I don't know if the letters to Li Hua, I don't know if you heard about this. Chinese students who study English are asked to, in the final exam, to write a letter to a pen pal in the US or in English. And they tend to use those letters to really not only practice their English, but to pour their hearts out about what they want to do, how they would like to meet them, and so on. But of course, those letters are never get a response. But now a whole community of Chinese people are really deeply touched because Li Hua has replied, and no, Li Hua has received the response. And I think that is so moving that there are these connections just latent there in the pre-individual atmosphere, and some trigger event just allows them to happen, especially with young people. And I think that is very hopeful, because hope is about precisely contributing to those atmosphere and those potentialities, not necessarily knowing the right action right now, but everything we do contributes. And eventually the trigger comes and releases the change. And I think that's very hopeful to say that.
Thank you, Ezequiel. And thank you, Ida. Okay, I'm aware of the time, and I wish we could linger and dwell with each of these reflections. I see, Hal, you've had your hand up for a while, so do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. This is the first time I've joined an MLE online workshop, and I have to say I feel very much at home, very comfortable in sharing ideas and values with all of you. It seems that a lot of what I've done in my adult life is to find ways to communicate the insights I've discovered in classical East Asian philosophy, particularly Taoism and Buddhism on the China side, to my to not just an audience of other scholars, but to my students. And it's a privilege, I think, to be able to teach and to develop different contemplative pedagogies to communicate that, and also to communicate to them that there is hope, and that there is a larger context in which all of this is occurring, that sometimes we get so focused in the present that we lose a sense of that. So one of the most important ideas that has come out of my engagement with also scholarship, but also Zen practice of 40 years or so with Rinzai teacher Sasaki Joshu Roshi, is that actually boils down to this, and I see this maybe as one of the whole discussion today is a way of working out the insights that this following insight, very simple insight that comes from the man who founded the Kyoto School in Japan, the Kyoto School of Zen philosophy. His name is Nishida Kitaro. Some of you may have read his book, An Inquiry into the Good, that Chris Ives and Abe Masao translated. And it's from that book that I want to take this very simple and very direct quote, paraphrase. It's not an exact quote. He says, "We commonly think that because we have a self, we have experiences." He said, but in Zen, what we say is, because there is experience, a self arises. I'm going to say that one more time. We commonly think that because we have a self, we have experiences. But in Zen, what we say is, because there is experience, a self arises. And what that means is that there is a continuum of experience. There is a common ground of consciousness that we all share, not just as humans, but as creatures. And you might even extend it to inanimate objects. And it is out of this common ground of consciousness, this common ground of experience, that all of our wonderful, myriad, difficult, individual manifestations through which we live in the moment, they arise. They arise, they persist, and they disappear. And keeping an awareness of that as we engage each of us in our specific environments and our specific worlds, and it has many different manifestations, is really important to the concrete work that each of us is doing. Because what it suggests is that, of course, we have all these wonderful differences that are important to celebrate and also to disagree with and recognize. But that underlying that, there is this common ground that we all share. And keeping an awareness of that, whether you keep it as an idea or whether you've had the great privilege of being able to directly experience that ground and try to communicate it to others. Keeping that is so important. It's so important, particularly in this moment, for the specific ways in which we engage with the world. So I just wanted to offer that and thank you all because I really see that it's like the thread in many ways that goes through all of what you were talking about today. And I'm so interested in how do we take that insight and work it out in the world?
Thank you, Hal. Really rich intervention. Does anyone want to respond or riff or reflect before we transition to another question in the chat that we have?
Also, just to say, we've been talking a lot about readiness and openness, and so thank you very much, Hal, for that intervention. And it's sort of a reminder of what Francisco called the virtuality of the self. And he said in a couple of different places, actually, our self is just an interface, or not just an interface. Our self is an interface. I think probably Ezequiel, you remember where he talks about that. So that speaks to what you're saying, is it's something that arises at certain moments under certain conditions of experience. So this virtuality or impermanence, or Francisco also said bleep up aspect of the self that bleeps up and then subsides is an important one to think about when we're also thinking about 8 questions of agency.
Mm-hmm. It also makes me think of, I was just reading some Goethe, who says a line something like, every object rightly contemplated opens an organ within us for its contemplation. Every object rightly contemplated opens an organ within us for its contemplation. That resonates some with what you shared, Hal. Also, that what I expose myself to, what I lend myself to, profoundly conditions or perhaps even constitutes who I am and myself. And it also makes me feel, gosh, as more and more songbirds are vanishing from this part of the world, as more and more shapes and styles of sentience and vital sensitivity are being shoved to the brink of extinction and then kicked over the brink. We are losing our own depths, the possibility, those organs within us that arise only in relation with otherness. And as the world is flattened of so much otherness, we become profoundly flattened ourselves. Yeah.
Oh, really exquisitely put. Thank you. Yeah, Stephen, you wanted to say something? Looks like no? No, okay. You looked at the ready. I was seeing a readiness and an openness at the same time. If we all have maybe just 5 to 7 more minutes to stay, we do have one more question in the chat, which I think could be interesting to bring up because it sort of flips the premise of the evening on its head in some sense. And so maybe we can close with a quick go around about how you would respond to this question. And so Frank, he writes, in today's times, I would want to question the notion that there is always a world ready at hand with readiness for action to every specific situation available, which is partly from the quote from Francisco Varela. It seems that such a world at hand requires a sufficiently rational, in quotes, and in the sense of regular, in quotes, environment. Otherwise, in the extremes, there's just chaos or randomness, or worse, a toxic world that seeks to work against us, perhaps to harm us. What if the problem is that a world at hand is not available, not the world we happen to be in? How can we exist and act in a world not there? And so he says to call it something like that, world hyphen, not hyphen there. And how can such worlds at hand be created, nurtured, and seeded? Yeah, Erin.
Yeah, I read the question in the chat, and I think the question of power is woven through it in an important way, and it's an important question to ask. I would probably ask it slightly differently, but that difference is important to hold on to. I would want to bring a concept that's been really important to me that comes from Naomi Chandler, and the concept is the para-ontological. And what Naomi Chandler has suggested with through a close reading of Du Bois is that blackness is a problem for thought. So he comes up with the idea of the para-ontological to talk about how blackness, and he's thinking here in the context of the Middle Passage and slavery and racism more broadly, can't work as a mode of thought within the dominant modalities of ontology, of being. So I'm often thinking about what the we takes for granted, whose ontology or under what conditions are we speaking about world? But I think that in the environment of Black studies, what we would hear, those of us who, are interested in this question, is that the world has never been given. It's only been given for some. There have been ongoing genocides of indigenous peoples in many of our backyards. And so perhaps what we're facing now in a very difficult way is some things that some people in the world know a lot about. They've had generations to think about how to engage with the problem of there never having been a world that was given, or a concept of self or a concept of being that was given. And in that way, it's perhaps an exciting time. I mean, I don't feel very excited about it today, but it is a time of change. There's no question. And I want to add something to that. I work very closely with a population that is always discounted. Have worked for 20 years with classical autistics who can't speak. And so I'm very familiar with how they're discounted all the time. I could be walking in the street with them, and everybody around just assumes that they have nothing to give, that they are not those humans for whom worlds are made. And so it's taught me to notice how some people are so sure that a world is made for them. And maybe that would be a place to think this question from.
Thank you for that, Erin. Really beautiful rearticulation and really powerful. As we're nearing the end, I'd invite just anyone else. We could do a quick go around if you just have any last thoughts on this particular question, but also even more broadly, because it's we have limited time, but it'd be nice to hear everyone's voice on these last few minutes, if you feel moved to share something. Yeah, Hanne.
Yeah, I think the way you put that, Erin, makes me feel like in the rise of fascism, like worlds are closing in, and now we realize, okay, we also have to push back to a world closing in or not being given anymore. And that's, as you said, in a way exciting, though also trembling excitement in a way, and fear, but maybe important, or I don't know. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Is there a word, because I don't know it, is there a word for that means listening inward while listening outward, or listening deeply outward while also listening deeply into one's own depths? I am needing such a word.
Perhaps, Dave, you could invent one for us, since you're quite the wizard with language.
Maybe Ezequiel has one.
Ezequiel, please.
I just wanted to bring back this very enactive phrase, which is we bring forth the world. In our experience, in our doing, we bring forth the world, and sometimes this is understood metaphorically, or we bring forth the values by which we understand the world epistemologically, but I think it's actually ontological. We bring forth the world in actions. We constantly create new things, and they're changing, and sometimes they're very minor things, and sometimes they're very big ones. And I think that again, coming to the idea of connecting all this with the notion of hope, I think if we are bringing forth world creatures, I need somebody who find the right word there. I think that then it's in the very central concept of an active approach that hope is always at hand. We shouldn't always remember that. We may forget it, but it's always at hand, because the world is not yet, it's still happening.
Thank you. That's really, really lovely. Yeah, Sāgaradevī.
I just wanted to build on that point and just mention a paper I've read recently on inactive ethics by Laura Candiotto and a co-author whose name I've forgotten. But I think there is a responsibility that we need to acknowledge in our creating of worlds, and how our creating of our world impacts the potential for other people to create their worlds. And I think that's been made really kind of clear in the call this evening. And yeah, and I think that need to develop an ethical sensitivity that allows for an imagination where other worlds are possible just feels so fundamental to me. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sāgaradevī. Nice to hear the word imagination come back into the space also. And I think the paper maybe is co-authored by Martin Weichold. Is that the one you're thinking of? So Laura Candiotto and Martin Weichold. Yeah, it's a beautiful paper. Anthony, Jennifer, or Stephen?
There's Hal up there too.
I'm sorry, Hal, I didn't see her. You wanted to say something?
Just in answer to David's question, and also a wonderful suggestion Ida made in the chat, but working with, she said attuned listening. And from my Taoist sources, I would call it a form of cognitive attunement. And that's attuning the inner and the outer. Comes about through practice, and in many ways is the goal of classical Taoist contemplative practice, cognitive attunement. We see it mostly with this wonderful Taoist philosopher teacher Zhuangzi from the late 4th, early 3rd centuries BCE. Cognitive attunement. Attunement's a great word.
Jennifer, yeah, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to close with, or the last thing I would say is just in relation to what Sāgaradevī was saying about how the importance of imagination, right? And what we can do is create spaces and try to open up spaces for these imaginative or imaginations to happen. That's critical for that to happen, right? Is this opening up of space within these different contexts, challenging contexts that we've described tonight, from many different perspectives. So maybe that's a positive way to end.
Mm. And it was in some of the materials we were sent, this notion of a world of many worlds. And surely what we've all been speaking of together is an experience of navigating within a world that is a world of worlds, within worlds, within worlds, within worlds. And yet it is our common world. Strangely.
I can just say that I really resonate with what he's been doing. I will not really have anything else to add, really, other than appreciating a lot of what has been shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonino. Stephen, did you want to?
And I don't really have much. I mean, I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I'm left actually really just pondering and letting what has been said somehow sink in. And I'm also aware that my wife is in the kitchen waiting for me to show up for dinner.
Well, maybe that's the best reason for us to consider concluding right now, because I'm sure many of us have a day or an evening to attend to after this meeting. So, and maybe to invite Amy back into the room with me, just to thank everyone really from our hearts at Mind and Life Europe. David, I'm just going to go across my screen, David and Sāgaradevī and Stephen and Jennifer and Hanna and Ezequiel and Erin and Antonino. And of course, everyone who joined us in the live Zoom room, your questions were rich and really fertile. And we will be continuing this reflection in some way throughout the year, because these inaugural panels are really meant to be inaugural in the sense of launching us into a year of reflections and continuing to open up the space of these questions. So we hope you'll join us for more online events and of course our in-person events like the Summer Research Institute in Europe. So thank you to all of our panelists once again, and we invite you to keep relating to the worlds with S, worlds all the way down, worlds at hand this year. And so I think we might just have an end slide with a couple of announcements, right? Just if you'd like to join us for some events in February, these are our next online events. We have an MLE Friends webinar on the first Thursday of the month. And so this is just a way for a smaller community to come together, a smaller community than we saw this evening. This was a pretty big Zoom call to have a more in-depth discussion on a particular theme that one of our association members has chosen. And then we, of course, have our podcast. If you're not already following it, feel free. Mind and Life Europe podcast, season 2, on knowing, being, and doing, inspired very much by the work of Hanna and Ezequiel and Core in Action semester 4 of last year. And we also have regular practice sessions, which are open to everyone, which are contemplative practice sessions, just an hour once a month, and some lightly guided practice. So with that, thank you. And Amy, did you want to say any final?
I just would like to thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you all at some point or another in the year to come, and unfold more of this thinking that's already pushed me in a whole bunch of other directions from the ones that I came with, and that's all we can ask for. Thank you.
Thanks. Delight to meet you all.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Stay well, stay safe, and stay sane. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.